I remember the office the day the costume party was announced. Coffee, toner, and a hint of something electric. We were weeks past the slow drag of Q3 and close to audits, but management promised a small rebellion. A costume party with prizes, awkward photos, and a chance to trade spreadsheets for absurdity. My name is Amir. I had a corner desk, headphones, and a nervousness that showed in small things. The way I tapped my pen, the way I rearranged paperclips. When HR's glittery email arrived, it felt like a ripple. The rules were simple. No offensive costumes, keep it PG, and participate to win. The prize was a vague corporate voucher and a picture in the monthly newsletter. It should have been a throwaway distraction, but the thought of playing at something else, of being noticed for what I chose to wear instead of what I'd submitted in last quarter's report, lodged into me. There were co-workers planning superhero capes and inflatable dinosaurs, but it was the casual, half-joking suggestion from my colleague Sarah that stuck. You should try a swap, she said, scrolling through a folder of outrageous ideas. Imagine you in one of the women's costumes. Bet you'd win for shock factor. Her smile was mischievous. She'd worn capes and false mustaches before. Come on, Amir. Live a little. I could never, I said, more to myself than to her. The line between a joke and a dare is short. My mind built a corridor of what-ifs that night, each possibility lit by a trembling bulb of curiosity. I had never dressed like a woman in any serious way beyond childish play. Still, there was a voice in the back of my head that watched images of gowns and eyeliner with the same odd attention that people reserve for sunsets. That voice was private, usually muted by reason and the daily safety of routine. But the party's promise loosened the edges of my usual caution. On a whim, spurred by Sarah's chuckle and the idea of winning something, I said yes to a small, reckless plan. Borrow a costume and try it for a laugh before the crowd. I went to the thrift store where costumes lived like retired actors waiting for a second act. The rack held sequins and tulle, satin and feathers. My fingers found a knee-length dress, dark and almost formal, patterned with tiny forget-me-not flowers. It was the kind of dress that could belong to an actress in an old film, or to someone who had always known they preferred a soft collar to a stiff one. I could have chosen a monstrous mask, something loud, but the dress felt quieter. It was small rebellion masquerading as innocence. When I took it home, I told myself it would be temporary. A laugh, a photograph, a story to file away. The night arrived with electricity that made me believe anything could change. The office had been turned into a dim, shimmering space. Streamers hung from fluorescent lights, paper lanterns hummed, and a playlist played songs that felt like snapshots of other people's bravado. I closed the bathroom door and started to build the woman I had bought as fabric and possibility. It began with socks and then stockings, a small victory as nylon slid against my skin. The dress was heavier than on the hanger. I stepped into it, zipped the back with both hands, and laughed at the sound my breath made. I pinned the hem and hesitated in front of the mirror. The man looking back at me had my face but a different frame. Makeup was something I had admired from a distance, the way it could carve out cheekbones, soften a jaw, or create an absence of dark under eyes. Sarah had left me a small bag with liner, mascara, and a neutral lipstick as if she knew that my fingers might tremble. I learned to hold the brush like one holds a pen before composing something important, each stroke an attempt to translate feeling into line. The eyeliner made my eyes read differently to me. The lipstick felt like an accent on words I had never said aloud. When I pinned my hair into curls with a cheap curling iron, the sound of the motor was the sound of a heartbeat. The office clock ticked on the other side of the door, indifferent to transformations. There's a peculiar moment when a costume stops being a costume. For me, it didn't happen with a final brushstroke or a triumphant spin. It was quieter. The bathroom light caught the curve of a cheek and I felt a hollow fill that was both foreign and expected. A memory surfaced. A girl in a school play whose name I could not place, the way the applause had felt like permission. I couldn't tell if I was remembering someone else or uncovering a layer of myself that had always been there but never permitted entrance. My breathing slowed. I looked at the reflection and felt the strange, heavy gift of recognition. The costume had created not a mask but a revelation. Downstairs the party had started. People filed in, some in elaborate get-ups, others less committed. I had planned the reveal as a joke. Sarah was waiting in the break room, a crown askew on her head, eyes bright. Her expression when I stepped out was a waveform of surprise, then amusement, then something softer, something like honest admiration. "Wow," she said, and there was no mockery in the way she said it. Raw sounded like a small offering. I should have laughed, that was the plan, but instead I felt a tremor of fear that ran under the edges of my smile. The floor became a stage and I walked as though trying on a new gait. I noticed details. The slight way everyone's gaze skittered from the dress to my hands, the tinny laughter that dissolved into a hush for a second. People gathered, jokes were cracked, and someone found a camera to document the absurdity. The office's natural language is small talk, and tonight it wrapped the strange scene in cheer. A few colleagues made the obvious, well-intended quips and then moved on. But there was one coworker, Oftab, who had always been blunt in a way that sometimes cut and sometimes cleared. He approached with the half-grin of someone who enjoys testing boundaries. "Amir, you look like you lost a bet," he said loudly, waiting for a laugh that didn't land. His voice filled a room already full of noise. For a beat I felt the familiar old armor of ingrained self-consciousness sliding on, as if I could borrow the old me back like a coat. I smiled, and inside, questions gathered like rain clouds. But Oftab's next words changed the weather. Instead of the expected ridicule, there was a carefulness in his tone I didn't expect. "Not bad," he said. "You pull it off." The crowd exhaled in sympathy turned curiosity. It felt like the edge had been blunted. People who had known me for years started asking how I had done my makeup, complimenting the fit, and someone, the HR manager, always hovering near the chairs with a neutral smile, suggested that I enter the costume contest. The idea of being judged by the same people who had critiqued my presentations for years felt monstrous and absurd in equal measure. Yet I found myself saying yes without understanding why. The costume contest was a parade more than a battle. We circled, posed, and took photographs as if trying to distill a single night's magic into pixels. When it was my turn, the applause was tentative at first and then oddly warm. Someone shouted a playful taunt, and another called out that I should change my LinkedIn headshot. Laughter bubbled around me. But beneath the surface, I felt something else. A steadying sense of alignment. Being seen in this new shape did not erase the years of timidity. It layered over them like a new coat. People clapped, but their clapping could not name the inner shift that felt like a hinge unlocking. The night loosened, and before the office emptied, a handful of us, Sarah, Oftab, the HR manager and one or two others, decided to keep the music on and migrate to the quieter end of the lounge. We sat on mismatched chairs and talked about trivial things. Client deadlines, recipes gone wrong, the weather. The conversation folded into something private. Sarah reached across and took my hand like someone steadying a friend on a rough sea. Her fingers were cool, and there was an honesty in her gaze that made me feel less like a curiosity and more like a person. "How does it feel?" she asked simply. I searched for the expected joke but found instead a truth I hadn't planned to speak. "I don't know," I said. "Different. Right, but also frightening." Right is a dangerous word because it's prescriptive. The night wasn't about labels. It was about a ripple that started small and kept expanding. I had to decide what name to give to that ripple. I thought about all the faces I had worn in my life. The obedient son, the diligent employee, the man people expected me to be. And I realized they had been costumes too. They were practical, useful, and sometimes comfortable, but they had never fit the way this moment fit. There is a difference between acting and becoming, between trying on and finding. The party had turned into a kind of workshop for identity, a place where experiment and revelation collided. When I got home that night, the dress smelled faintly of perfume and copier ink. I didn't hang it in the wardrobe and I didn't fold it away. I left it over a chair like a thing that might be needed again. Sleep was thin. Dreams felt like reeds bending in a wind I could not name. Morning came with the usual list of practicalities. Coffee, emails, a commute. Yet under the ordinary shell of the day, there was a brightness I couldn't shake. I kept catching myself in the reflection of shop windows or a phone screen and pausing, as if I had a new permission to look. The trickle of the previous night had become a stream that touched strange parts of my day-making. It would have been easy to tuck the experience away as an embarrassing office story. But small acts echo. The next week a new assignment came. A project requiring client-facing work at a 3-night event. My manager asked if I wanted to lead the presentation and I, without understanding why, said yes. The thought of standing on stage in front of strangers twisted my chest with fear and a curious hunger. I prepared, rehearsed, and arranged slides, but the workweek's edges held a new softness. I noticed the cut of my shirt like I had noticed the dress's hem. I carried a compact mirror because I found myself adjusting my appearance with more care, not for others but for myself. At the client's event the world pulsed with polite applause and fluorescent light. I walked on stage in a familiar suit and spoke with a practiced cadence, and off stage, an assistant asked if I would try a different outfit for a promotional photograph. I could have said no, retreated into the old me, but a memory of the dress draped over a chair nudged me. I agreed. They handed me a soft blouse and a blazer cut to soften my shoulders. The stylist adjusted my hair and applied a sweep of powder as if smoothing away fatigue. The photo was quick, but between flash and instruction something shifted. Cameras had always collected who I was meant to be. Professional and unremarkable. This time the camera captured a version that felt more honest. When the photograph appeared on the event website, a few surprised messages arrived, and my sister wrote, "You look peaceful." Those 2 words felt like a soft hand on my shoulder. Jessica, a name that had not been mine, began to arrive in small, private ways. It was a secret nickname from a friend who thought names could be windows. I didn't announce anything publicly. I began to practice pronouns quietly in the solitude of my morning routine, feeling the shape of words like clothes that might someday fit. It wasn't a rebellion for others. It was a reorientation for myself. The fluidity of how I presented on different days became an experiment in honesty. Some days I wore a sharper suit, other days a blouse under a ragged cardigan. People noticed. The ones who mattered noticed with curiosity and nonchalance. The ones who didn't notice at all kept the world humming, untroubled. Sometimes early mornings brought panic, the fear that I had invented a part of myself that would not hold up under the daylight. I worried about parents and the faces that had raised me, about cultural expectations that move like tides. There were moments when my reflection in the bathroom looked like a stranger who had borrowed my life. Those moments were heavy with the possibility of loss. But alongside that fear was a steady knot of something vibrant, an expanding tenderness for myself that had been hushed for years. I learned to be patient with the 2 voices, the one that wanted to retreat and the one that wanted to step forward. And in doing so I found a rhythm. At work, the small shifts rippled. People who once greeted me with a curt nod now offered real questions. "How are you, Amir?" A name sometimes used as shorthand for the old version of me. I responded honestly more often than not. I told a few close co-workers that I had been trying something new for myself and left the rest unsaid. Sarah became a steady confidant. Aftab, with his bluntness, became protective in a way that surprised us both. The HR manager suggested a company policy refresh on inclusivity, and then moved on with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who believed in structure more than sermons. The office began to feel less like a place that boxed people into roles and more like a loose, shifting mosaic. One evening, weeks after the party, I received a message from a woman named Layla. She had found my photograph online and recognized something in my eyes. An urgency, perhaps, or a softness, and reached out to say that she had lived with similar questions for years. Her words were careful. She did not ask for details she had no right to know, nor did she demand labels. "If you want to talk," she wrote, "I know how complicated it can be when you start to notice yourself." We met for tea in a small cafe, each of us carrying our own histories like folded newspapers under our arms. Layla's conversation was a map of grief and courage. She had navigated family expectations, quiet workplaces, and small victories in dressing rooms and bathrooms. She told stories that felt both stranger and intimately familiar. Her tales were not about glamorous transformations but about small, ordinary acts of making a life that matched a feeling. Over cups of hot tea, we traced the lines between appearance and truth, between the costumes of youth and the authenticity of adulthood. She offered practical guidance and a kind of steadiness I didn't realize I'd been missing. Through Layla's friendship I learned practical things. How to choose fabrics that felt good against my skin, how to find tailoring that didn't flatten the shape of who I was, and how to insist on kindness in spaces that were indifferent. But she also taught me how to stand with uncertainty without surrendering to it. There were nights when tears came because a receptionist had asked a question with a tone that suggested disbelief. And there were nights when the mirror returned someone whole. One major family gathering came during this period of slow exploration. I had not planned to reveal anything. I had not planned to hide either. I arrived wearing a smart blazer and a scarf that could pass as a simple accessory or a private flag. My mother eyed me the way you do when a plate is lifted from a cupboard and something unexpected falls out. Surprise, then curiosity, then something like sorrow as if a memory had been rearranged. We spoke in small sentences. My father's voice was careful and measured. He asked practical questions about work and health before the rest. The conversation with my parents did not explode. It unraveled slowly, knot by knot. There were silences heavy with old expectations and moments of small kindness that felt almost like miracles. My sister texted later to say that it had been hard but that she loved me. The love was not the all-clear I had hoped for, but it was a foothold. Real change, I learned, was not a single act but a series of little negotiations over time. Months passed. The dress that had been a catalyst was no longer just an object. It was a way into a life that felt more honest than the one I had tiled together before. At times the world pushed back. A snide comment from a stranger, a form that assumed boxes that did not fit. Each push required a reply, sometimes firm and angry, sometimes weary and explanatory. The work of being who you are is both public and domestically tender. There was a night when I almost gave up the experiment. Office politics had layered onto my chest like weights, and a rumor started that I was difficult because I was making personal choices that some found distracting. I considered shelving the changes until the dust settled. But then Layla sent a message with a single sentence. You are not changing the world overnight. You are making your corner of it livable. Her words were like a small lantern in a dark alley. On the anniversary of the costume party, I walked back into the office slightly differently. I didn't wear the dress. Instead, I wore a tailored blouse with a small necklace that glinted in the fluorescent light. Someone asked, "Back to make another entrance?" And I smiled. The memory of that night had become less about spectacle and more about initiation. I had moved from accident to intention. The emotional twists that had once felt like jagged breaks began to smooth into a narrative arc that felt authored by me. I accepted that identity is not necessarily a single finished pronouncement but a sentence written and rewritten. There were days when a pronoun fit like a glove and days when it pinched. I learned to give myself permission to wear both. The office, with its small tragedies and daily dramas, continued to be a place of comedy and comfort. As the months stretched, I found confidence in tiny rituals. The way I smoothed the scarf before a meeting, the manner I spoke in presentations, the small gesture of adding a bracelet that jingled when I reached for a file. Those rituals were not about performance for others, but about signaling to myself that I was present. People who had known me longer began to call me by a softer version of my name in private moments, and once or twice a mentor said something that felt like validation. "You bring calm to the room," she said when I finished a tricky presentation, and for a moment I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with costume or spectacle. There were moments of loss too. A friendship that had been steady began to fray. The person could not bridge the internal change and drifted away. It hurt in the way any loss of a long habit hurts, but it also brought relief because it made room for relationships that could hold what I was becoming. I met others through Layla, through small classes, and at a community group where stories were exchanged like recipes. Each person I met added a new ingredient to the stew of my life. One morning, months later, I stood before a mirror and tried on the dress again. It fit differently now, Perhaps I had changed, or perhaps the dress had been waiting in the same way a truth waits for a door to open. When I stepped outside in it, a neighbor smiled and said, "You look wonderful today." He didn't make a show of it. He didn't gossip. His words landed like sun on old wood, slow and warming. I began to think of transformation less as a single dramatic moment and more as a series of small permissions. To laugh loudly, to choose a color I liked, to introduce my friend Layla to my sister without preamble. These actions accumulated and created a life that felt less like a costume and more like clothing worn by someone who had come to know their own measure. Through it all, there was an ongoing negotiation with fear. Fear will show up in many guises, as anger, as withdrawal, as a sudden craving for invisibility. My strategy became a practice in curiosity. When fear arrived, I tried to ask what it wanted rather than react immediately. Sometimes the answer was that I needed rest. Sometimes it asked me to stand firmer. Work continued. Reports were submitted and presentations delivered. In the small ways, the office became more expansive. Policies shifted, conversations opened, and the company invited workshops about inclusion not as moralizing lectures but as practical training. Some of that was because of me and the photograph on the event website. Most of it was because the world is a slow machine that adjusts when people make room for conversation. I should be clear. This story is not a clean arc of triumph. There are still mornings of doubt, still masked chapters when public paperwork insists on boxes and answers I haven't decided upon. But there is also a persistent, undeniable fact. I learned to trust the sensation of recognition when it came. I learned that being seen can be terrifying and liberating at once, and that the most radical kindness you can give yourself is permission to try on what you might be. The transformation that began as a costume at a silly office party had become, in time, a change in relationship with myself. It rewired how I noticed little details, how I approached conversation, and how I allowed myself to be loved and to love back. It didn't solve everything. There were still bills and mundane annoyances, but it reshaped my compass. At the next costume party, months later, I didn't make an entrance to shock anyone. I came with Sarah and Layla as friends, not as characters. We laughed over the same playlist, and someone asked if I still had the dress. I told them where it hung and that it had been useful. The crowd had changed as well, not wholly but subtly. Where once there had been more of a spectacle, now there was quieter curiosity, which felt to me like progress. What I want people to take from this story is not the image of a man turned into a woman in one night, but the idea that identities are sometimes discovered by accident. A costume party did not make me into anyone overnight. It opened a door I might have left unopened for years. It was a catalyst and a mirror, an invitation to interrogate the life I had been given and the life I wanted to craft. Change is messy and slow. It requires friends who will sit with you when you can't find the words, strangers who offer unexpected kindness, and a willingness to be both brave and tender. It asks you to chart a course that will sometimes look messy to others and to yourself. The crucial part is this. You do not have to have everything figured out to begin. You only need one small, curious step. My small step was slipping into a dress for a laugh. The result was not a punchline but an unfolding. I do not wear the same name every day. I carry a handful of words that help me move through the world, and some days I present in a way that feels more traditionally masculine and other days more feminine. Sometimes I meet people who can't understand why. I answer with practice and patience. Sometimes I meet people who have lived this journey longer and who nod, eyes wise with the knowledge of small wars won. Those nods sustain me. Looking back, the costume party feels like the hinge in a long, complicated door. The hinge was rusty and surprising, but it worked. And opening that door did not lead to a single destination but to a home I am still building. There are rooms in that home that are still dim, corners I am learning to light. The work of identity is an act of daily construction. A decision about how to speak, how to dress, how to introduce myself to the mirror and to others. I hope this story offers one modest kind of permission, that exploration can be gentle and that revelation can arrive wrapped in laughter. Not every experiment will be permanent and not every risk will end happily, but every honest step teaches something. The night at the office started as a spectacle and became a turning point because it contained real people who offered me both kindness and the permission to step into myself. If you find the idea of change frightening, know that fear is expected. Fear is a companion, not an indictment. You can welcome it and still move. Take small steps. Keep the people who make you feel safe near. Practice the pronouns and the outfits and the ways of being you imagine until they become less foreign. There is no one map for everyone. What worked for me may look different for you. That is the point. There are many ways to be yourself. My life now is not a tidy narrative but a living one, stitched together by decisions and missteps and small mercies. I keep the dress not as a relic but as evidence that sometimes the world will give you a chance to try on a truth. I keep my friends close and I keep learning. There are days of grief and days of light. There are meetings and grocery lists and the quiet pleasures of a cup of tea on a rainy morning. These ordinary things are my anchors. To anyone who has stumbled across a truth about themselves in an unexpected place, the costume party that turned me into a woman was not a single miraculous trait change. It was the start of a long, patient conversation with myself. It involved courage, yes, but also the small acts that sustain courage. Showing up, asking for help, letting friends in and being willing to say, I don't know yet. I hope you find gentle doors. I hope you find people who will hold lanterns beside you. And I hope you find the small, steady courage to take one curious step. If you find this story and wonder whether a single night can alter the arc of a life, know that it's not magic but permission. Permission to notice, to try, to name a feeling, to be tender with fear and patient with progress. Begin with one small, curious step and allow the rest to be written in time. You might be surprised how much that step changes everything.